Mother of 6 breaks up family home. Carried on adulterous affair while husband was away at front. That was a headline in the West Australian newspaper in 1920, and the mother of 6 in question was my great-grandmother. I was brought up with the family myth and legend that when my great-grandfather went away to fight in the First World War, he enrolled age 41 in 1916, so the war had already been going for a couple of years. Enrolled in the war, enlisted in the war, in Fremantle, Western Australia, got on HMS, or Her Majesty's Persic, and went off to England to do a bit of training, and then from there, one of the worst, most horrific campaigns of the First World War, in Flanders Field. My great-grandfather suffered, I can only imagine what he suffered, the horrors of war. He came back alive, thankfully, after he even stayed on like a year after the armistice, and funeral detail. But meanwhile, back in Western Australia, see, I was brought up to be told that when my great-grandfather returned from the front after a couple of years of utter horror in World War I, he disembarked at Fremantle Jetty and was met at the wharf by my great-grandmother. And when he said to my great-grandmother, "Where are the kids?" she said they were all in Barbados. And this bit was always uttered in thrilled tones, they say they had to take his gun off him or he would have shot her then. Implication being that my great-grandmother wasn't worth a pinch of shit, had failed in her womanly duties as mother and wife, and it was added for emphasis that she just put all the kids in Barbados and took up with a fancy man. And my great-grandfather, when he came back from the war, got all the kids back together again under one roof. To his credit, he did that. But then he wouldn't let any of them have anything to do with their mother ever again. And the only one who maintained contact with her was my grandfather. Sadly, he passed away when he was in his mid-40s and was outlived by his mum. So my great-grandmother had adult children walking around in the same town as she was, and none of them would give her the time of day because she was so awful. Such a failure as a woman and a wife and a mother to have bundled all her children to Barbados and taken up with a fancy man. And you don't think about this, of course, when you're a kid, because they're just, your ancestors are just minor characters in a story that you think is already over. At least you did when I grew up. But then when I'm mid-20s, when I was at uni, we had to do like, writing projects and community writing and family histories and that sort of thing as a point of research. And I started to look at the context, of course, of my great-grandmother. This was in the mid-90s, so there was, information available by the internet, but not as much as there is now. So when I went to uni and started doing the community writing and family history, I started to think about my great-grandmother and what actually might have been going on in her life at that point. It was also noted that she had many children, half a dozen children, but she also, around 1915 or so, had triplets, one of whom was stillborn. So she was left with 2 surviving triplets. They were the last babies that she had in that marriage, and she still had like 4 or 5 others, from like mid-teens down to infants. So one can only imagine what that alone, like poverty, was like the early 20th century in Fremantle. Not many people had a lot of money. It was rougher times. It was a depression on. Not much money, loads of kids, an unsympathetic husband, and infant mortality, infant loss. She lost a baby, and at the time that she had those triplets, she wouldn't even have known she was having triplets. She would have just thought she was having a very big baby, and someone said, "Oh, I reckon there might have been twins in there," because neonatal care was not exactly as it is now. And then, of course, time rolls on. Ancestry.com and MyHeritage and all those family tree subscription information programs come around, and with the aid of the census and historical documents, we can put a bit more flesh on the bones of my great-grandmother's story. Mother of 6, breaks up family home, commits adultery while husband is at front. My great-grandmother was born in a Liverpool slum to a mother who was born of Irish famine immigrants. So in the mid-1840s, a family from Castlebar, Mayo, starved off their land, got onto a ship, went to Liverpool, where they had a daughter. And when that daughter grew up and was about 40, she and her husband, who was born of Welsh immigrants who had moved to Liverpool, they took their daughter, my great-grandmother, who was born in a Liverpool slum, to Irish and Welsh families, out to Fremantle, Western Australia, about 1890. She was in her late teens. She wouldn't have been well educated, although she was literate. She wasn't in Fremantle very long before she found herself married and pregnant to the son of an Englishman who had moved from the Eastern States goldfields to the West Australian goldfields and had struck it lucky. We have luck. Bad and good. But he struck it lucky in the goldfields and spent the next few years taking his young Liverpudlian wife and their ever-growing brood between Perth and Fremantle and the goldfields in Western Australia, places like Boulder, where my grandfather was born, which would have been an extremely hostile environment for Europeans in the early 19th century, considerably more hostile to the indigenous people once the Europeans arrived, obviously. I was born on Noongar land in southwest of Western Australia. Australia was and always will be Aboriginal land, and the sovereignty was never ceded. But as part of the English invasion and occupation of Australia, some of my ancestors, obviously, came out to Australia, one of which said great-grandmother, who found herself pregnant and married to a Aussie, first-generation Aussie, born to an Englishman, miner from the goldfields, who struck it rich and was doing very well. He was president of the Miners' Union. He sang at, gentlemen's events where there were cigars and brandy afterwards. He was an agitator and social organiser of mining unions. He was also, it transpires, a fecking Mason. Protestants, what can you do? He was, as I say, he worked in the gold fields, but he was a bootmaker. So when I was a child, I thought it was very glamorous. We had his boot last, the frame which you put the boots and shoes over to cobble. He was a bootmaker, and when he came back from the war, he was also an SP bookie, which is an illegal bookie, starting price odds. But in 1912, my great-great-grandmother, the one who was born in Liverpool and then came out to Fremantle with her husband and her teenage daughter for a better life, died in a train accident. She was disembarking the train between Perth and Fremantle at the North Fremantle station when she slipped between the carriage and the platform, and the train ran over her leg, amputating it, and she died a couple of hours later in Fremantle Hospital of shock and blood loss. She was only in her early 60s, and she had only been in Western Australia for a dozen years or so. The irony, really. When I lived in Perth, the thing I used to love doing most of all was catching the train from Perth Central out to Fremantle. It's a lovely train journey, and Fremantle's fabulous. And little did I know all those times I was enjoying it. My poor great-great-grandmother had met her end, as it were, at North Fremantle Station beneath the wheels of a train. So my great-grandmother, married to an unsympathetic Protestant husband who liked to make a big fellow of himself by singing at events for gentlemen and being a Freemason and being president of the Miners' Union and, a lad about town, upwardly mobile, we'd say in the 80s, aspirational. while he was doing all that, my great-grandmother was dealing with a brood of children and probably not much money because he was drinking it, wasn't he, while he was out being a big fellow, singing in pubs and at gentlemen's dinners with cigars and talking about the President's Union. She was stuck at home with children. And then her mum died in a horrific way, which must have been a bit of a blow. Cut to 1920, and that headline again: mother of 6 breaks up family home. Adulterous affair while husband is at front. So in 1920, the article is printed in the paper, and 100 years later, the article is online. Part of a trove of historical documents from the early colonisation of Western Australia, and there's my great-grandmother among them, with her decree nisi there for everyone to read about in the most scandalous of terms. Mother of 6 breaks up family home. And we finally get the context, don't we? Now, this article was nothing short of slut-shaming. They were not exactly understanding in the earliest 20th century in Perth, Fremantle, about women with PTSD, postnatal depression, infant loss and substance abuse. I'll tell you how the article went. The judge said that my great-grandmother had absolutely no excuse for her behaviour. Now let me take you through the behaviour. For a start, my great-grandfather, having returned from the war, had a lawyer, of course, because he would have been helped out, being a man and a soldier. With my great-grandmother had no representation, and in those days, in order to attain a divorce, you had to have a co-respondent, as it were, a reason for the divorce. There was no such thing as no-fault divorce. You had to have a legal reason by reason of desertion or abuse or adultery, etc. So if you wanted to get away from a man who wasn't particularly nice to you, you usually had to take one for the team and be allowed to be allow yourself to be photographed in your knickers by a private detective or some such. The article about my great-grandmother said that when my great-grandfather told my great-grandmother that he had enlisted for the war, she started drinking. No shit. Well, something had to take the edge off, didn't it? But she'd sworn she wouldn't touch it while he was away at the front. 6 kids, and her mother had been run over by a train a couple of years before, and she probably didn't have very many friends because she got there from Liverpool just a few years before and was like dragged out to the goldfields. When did she have time to make friends or support or anything like that? In the article it said they had moved to Perth. They'd moved to Claremont because my great-grandmother had been in the habit of associating with undesirable women in Fremantle, and my great-grandfather was trying to break her of it. Trying to break her of it. What, like a horse, you mean? Or a dog? Her spirit, was it, that you were trying to break? Well, she found friends. She found friends, but of course we know those friends were looked down upon because they hung around pubs, Freo pubs. They were probably sex workers. If they weren't actually sex workers, they were good time girls or just good sorts. Scandalous in itself, particularly in the time of clap and no contraception. But there wasn't any doll like. You've got to find your own way in the world. So he moved her back to Perth with the kids, away from Fremantle, in order to break her of it, hanging out with undesirables and having a drink. This is the man who was out all the time drinking with his fellows. And then he went off to the war and left her all alone. While he was away at the war, her dad died. Her dad was still alive and he had come to Fremantle also from Liverpool. And he passed away too. So she was left all by herself. She had a brother on the census for a couple of years and then he disappeared. I cannot find hide nor hair of him anywhere other than a prison record for a week for drunk and disorderly, not long after their mum died. So who knows what happened to him? Perhaps he went eastern states and the Spanish flu got him and no one ever found out what happened to him, but I'm sure my great-grandmother was missing him too, wherever he had got to. The article goes on to describe the incident, which had been characterised to me as a little girl as when he got onto the wharf and asked where the kids were, she said they're all in Barbados, and they say they had to take his gun off him right there on the spot or he would have shot her. The article said that my great-grandmother, who is now currently living in an unfurnished hovel in West Perth. Try finding an unfurnished hovel in West Perth in 2022, by the way. Had been living in the house, the rented accommodation that my great-grandfather had set up as a family home with the children. And then she got a lodger. She got a lodger. No one believed that he was the lodger because they were obviously having some sort of sexual tryst. Maybe they were. Maybe they weren't. No one will ever really know, I guess. But this lodger, let's call him Mr. X. Mr. Lodger kept her in the drink. She obviously has substance abuse problems. She drank. People can say there's no excuse for drinking. Well, sometimes, if you're of that sort of disposition, once you start, it's very hard to stop. I'm lucky. I really am lucky. Because I don't really fancy the drink. And the few times in my life where I've got, Christ, I need a drink, I've deliberately not had one. Because once you start thinking you need it, that's the slippery fucking slope, isn't it? But in 1916, what's my great-grandmother going to do? She's friendless. Her husband has fucked off to the other end of the world. There's no video calls. He was probably dead. He was in the battalion, by the way, my great-grandfather. They left with thousands and thousands and thousands of men, and they came back with 80. 80 from thousands and thousands of 44th Battalion. That wiped out in the most revolting trench warfare through Belgium and France that you could think about. He was shot himself, like he was a messenger on a motorbike, and he was knocked off his motorbike by machine gun fire, and he got back on and delivered his message. What are you going to do? Not get back on? But back to the article. My great-grandmother had a lodger, and someone was keeping an eye on her. Someone was keeping a very close eye on her, because the state inspector was hanging around outside the front of her house to see what time she came home and in whose company. And then the state inspector, or the school inspector, came by at 11 o'clock in the morning and found that several of the kids were only half dressed when they should have been in school. So they took the children away from her. The state took my great-grandmother's kids out of her family home, where she had a lodger. Maybe she was bonking him, maybe she wasn't. He probably wasn't a good guy. And the article said that my great-grandmother went to the inspector 3 days before my great-grandfather was due to arrive back in the port of Fremantle, and asked for her children to be given back to her so they could come and meet their dad at the wharf and be a family again. And they said no. They wouldn't give her kids back. Was it because the kids were better off without her? No. That's what they would have told her. Because that's what misogynists like to tell women, that their kids are better off without them if the women behave in a way contrary to Protestant rule. Imagine the difference it would have made if those uptight Protestant inspectors of the Crown had given my great-grandmother her kids back 3 days before her husband was due to come home from the war. Instead, when he came home and he found out, he threw her away, threw her out, told her not to come back, and would not be with her ever again. He got the kids back, he wouldn't have anything to do with her ever again. There was a very interesting thing in the article also. There was a witness. A prosecution witness, it might as well have been. There's a witness in the divorce case called Mr. Morgan. And Mr. Morgan, a caretaker, it said in the newspaper, said that he had lent a coat to the co-respondent, that would be my great-grandmother, and it hadn't been returned, so he went up to fetch it from the house, and met the lodger there, and thought that the lodger was carrying on. The lodger had referred to my great-grandmother as the missus, and they were seen drinking in the town together. Mr. Morgan was a great witness to prove my great-grandfather's case, that my great-grandmother was derelict in her duty as wife and mother, and was drinking, day drinking with the lodger, and shouldn't have access to her children. My great-grandmother, after being named as co-respondent and slut-shamed all through the West Australian, and never seeing her kids again except my my grandfather, the only one who kept in contact with her until he died, 20 years before she did. My great-grandmother remarried a couple of years after the divorce was granted and had a baby, another baby, her last baby, and apparently had a modicum of happiness for the rest of her life. I hope so. Do you know who my great-grandmother married a couple of years after her divorce was granted and she was slut-shamed for all of Western Australia and Australia to read via the papers for betraying the brave soldier, the drunk, the abusive drunk, who abandoned her and went away to war? She married Mr. Morgan. I think Mr. Morgan might have had a bit of an axe to grind when he turned up in that court case. My poor, silly great-grandmother, a young immigrant from Liverpool of Irish and Welsh parents, brought out to Perth in 1890 when there was nothing there except that she could have recognised from her home at the beginning of like English invasion and colonialism, the original sin of the stolen land. They wouldn't have understood most of the English from that perspective because, you know, the Crown had a vested interest in keeping people of other countries seen as savages that needed to be made Christians. It was a good excuse for taking all their resources. And so, you know, the working class English and Irish and whatever were shanghaied into doing the dirty work for them by going and occupying the countries, thinking they had new opportunities away from the slums of Liverpool. Yes, it was someone else's country. My family was starved out of Ireland, couldn't get ahead in England, and offered better opportunities in Australia. Of course, they took it, pleased to have the opportunity. However, there were already people in Australia that had been there for 65,000 years. But it was truly an Englishman's world in 1920. So my poor, silly, young Liverpool emigrant great-grandmother, knocked up when she was a teenager by, ironically, I would say, the lodger, who turned out to be my great-grandfather, given many children, suffered the loss of infants. Her husband went away to war. Both her parents died. She had a brother who disappeared off the face of the planet. She drank. She lost her friends. She was despised by all and sundry in the papers. Can you imagine today if a woman was separated from her family, having complete mental health crisis, and they put it in like page 10 that she was currently living in an unfurnished hovel, as though it was any of her fault, and the judge said she had no excuse, she was provided for. So, it seems I've been slut-shamed for generations, because guess what? I'm a mother of 6. My family home can probably never be described as entirely stable, and through not entirely any fault of my own, most of my children have had an absent father because I was widowed very young, and in Peter Steve freefall, just scrabbling to stay on top of things ever since, quite frankly. So there you go. intergenerational trauma doesn't even begin to cut it. But there you go. In defence of my great-grandmother and the slut-shaming of Protestant patriarchal rags, still published today. It's the only place West Australians get their information from. And it's sadly right-wing and sadly revoltingly churchy even today. With its, curse of Eve, women in Western Australia are still looked upon the same way as they were when they brought out on the bridal ships from Ireland and England. Only good for one thing. Here we all are, in the 21st century, looking back across our heritage and thinking, so this is how we got here. My great-grandmother, that awful woman who threw all her children into Barbados and took up with a fancy man. That wasn't really her story. That was the story the men gave her to excuse their behaviour towards her, and no one gave a shite how she felt. So there you go. That's my great-grandmother. Slut-shamed. I know how she feels. I really do. There you go. That's my vlog on a Monday in defence of my slut-shamed great-grandmother. I'll see you when you've got nothing on.